Hi, I am Mr. Drakeson so far. I'm going to be doing a thing on the first ever class of cinema history, history of horror movies so far. Well, I kind of been gone quite a while, even though I had some bloggings and things to catch up on and let you know with some things after all. I got 2 subscribers right now and I got plenty of likes on my channel and don't you forget to be able to even have even more of it to subscribe and like anyway. Okay, well, long before, but let's get on to the topic so far. Long before actually films were made, that we all had the thing with the horror stories like ghosts, monsters, and all, and telling them, and anyway, and even monsters were in Greek mythology and in through time, and even times about even things with serial killers were also in history as well. Make it the topic of horror. In 1890, in 1896, with the invention of the film and the movie projector, that the very first horror movie came out was The Devil's Castle. In 1910s, the early 20th century, some of the ones I do know was a right, right. Okay. Well, the Edison films actually came out with a Frankenstein movie, and what in 1910, and while in 1915 they also had the Golem, that was actually based from a Jewish folklore about a clay figure that comes to life. In 1920s with okay, yeah, okay, sorry about that. 1921, actually one of the first mainstream recognizable horror movies came out was The Cabinet of Dr. Kari Gog. Was during the silent, of course, it was still in the silent film era with a mad with a doctor who kind of actually hypnotizes a woman walking there with the whole abstract images. And I know it's also what they used in music videos like Rob Zombie's Living Dead Girl and the Red Hot Chili Peppers music video of On the Other Side with that. And also in 1922, the first actual recognizable mainstream vampire was Nosferatu. And facing, I'm wearing the shirt right now. It was actually a German film that was first released in Germany during that year. And it was actually based from the story. It was based on the book of Dracula, and they had to change it a bit with the name of the character from Dracula to Count Orlok. But when it released in 1929 in the US, it actually called him considered to be Dracula, and still is the most spookiest and creepiest scary film by this day. And Haxan, that was also sort of like a form of a documentary that teaches the history of the ages of witchcraft, with pretty much showing images of the demons and the witches, and even the director himself was actually played the devil in it. And it's actually pretty interesting to see that one as well. It's also my all-time favorite, same as Nosferatu. But also, there were times they also had like Lon Chaney Sr., who did some of the ones like Phantom of the Opera and a few other stuff. And well, that was kind of the idea with the American horror movies were during that time were about the man obesity, and the Germans were about the supernatural kind after all. The 1930s was considered the golden age of horror movies. What? Well, even with Universal Studios came out with the famous one of the few of the famous horror movies, monsters of all time, like came out with in 1931 with Frankenstein, that was played by known to play by Boris Karloff, and Dracula by Bela Lugosi. That was one of his famous parts ever, and the most iconic image of Dracula was from this movie. In 1932, the very first zombie movie came out with White Zombie. They did not start it out as actually the ones we know by the slowly rotted ones that end up eating the living and saying brains. They started out with slowly hypnotizing working zombies and also had Bela Lugosi in it. And it's also the name of the band that Rob Zombie was in during in the 90s called White Zombie. I believe between 1935 or 1936 it was. Werewolf of London was pretty much kind of the first mainstream werewolf movie. Kind of actually started with the sort of a wolf-like personality change, like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, as well. And in 1941, Universal came out with The Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman, kind of the one where he changes into the wolf creature bought from a full moon by the pure heart. And mostly during that time in the 1940s, it was all a little bit to the monster mash horror movies were kind of what was in with crossover films like like Frankenstein meets Wolfman, something like that. After all, and they also had a few other things as well. In the 1950s, when they kind of got a little bit after World War II, they kind of pretty much got fear of actual real life and all, and it kind of with the nuclear explosions, it kind of created sort of the way of the idea of doing the sci-fi horror movies known as the B movie age in the 50s. Sorry about that. Later. Okay. Most commonly, the type of movies were alien invaders, giant monsters, and science creatures gone wrong were actually most commonly those type of movies. In 1957, the Hammers Films actually emerged was a British company that actually made their movies a bit in color and even a bit more darker and even a bit kind of scarier and start off with The Curse of Frankenstein after all. Okay. And also 1958 was also Horror of Dracula, actually the most well known of the first of the Hammers films that started the whole series of the Dracula films, and same thing with the Frankenstein films. And they pretty much went on from the late 50s through the 60s to the mid 70s with most of the Hammers films after all. Okay. In 1960, the filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock had released Psycho. Pretty much, kind of was the really the first slasher movie ever, as well, with the famous shower kill scene. Go, yep, and it was actually shot in black and white, and they actually used chocolate syrup for the blood. Anyway, okay. And first released independently was Night of the Living Dead. The guy who came up with the idea was George A. Romero, and this was the one we actually kind of is the most famous zombie movie ever, where it had the idea to make the zombies into the slowly walking, flesh-eating zombies what we know by today, and it was considered one of the few last of the black and white horror movies. Oops, sorry, still in the 60s. And also, I believe that Rosemary's Baby came out in 1968 or probably 69. Not remember sure. It's really the one that kind of about a girl who gets actually a woman actually lives in an apartment in New York and actually gets pregnant by the devil and give birth by a demon child and actually live with a apartment full of witches in New York, and kind of did also start the idea of the whole in the late 60s and early 70s with the evil possessed demonic children's as well. Sorry about that. I'm just gonna sorry explain about that. Okay, actually, in the early part of the 1970s, also had the way with the slasher movies that got even a bit more edgier than what Psycho was. Pretty much like Hills Have Eyes and The Last House on the Left. Left. In 1973, they consider the most scariest horror movie of all time is The Exorcist. That pretty much about a girl named Reagan who gets possessed by a demon or the devil, and had some of the iconic scenes like the head spinning and the green vom and the levitating. And they probably might still even consider this is pretty scary for today by some as well. In 1974, even with another slasher base with it, where it's actually known for using the power tools, the chainsaw, with actually the low budget film called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre had really released. In 1975, the film Jaws that started the whole summer blockbuster with the idea of the shark, great white shark in the water, and makes you afraid of going in the water. And this is what kind of made Spielberg of who he is today. And there's probably ones that would still be afraid of going in the water after seeing this movie. And actually, the Sean William Scott music, it probably made it what it was. Okay, also, Black Christmas probably came out between 78 and 75. This was kind of the first ever time they end up using the holiday slasher movie with the sorority girls and actually uses the whole view of the killer of the camera angle as well. Halloween, the one that was actually the holiday slasher movie that takes place in Halloween, that was developed by John Carpenter a bit, and even started the whole launching of the slasher movies during the early 80s, especially with holidays and days or all kinds of other stuff as well. Even though it had the theme music that's iconic, and the idea with Laura, and even with Jamie Lee Curtis, that was the daughter of Janet Lee Curtis that actually got her start from this movie about the killer named Michael Myers who wears a mask, escapes from a mental hospital, and stalks and kills babysitters. Okay, in the early 80s, you also had pretty much, of course, the slasher movies with Friday the 13th. That was the one that started the whole gory slasher movies about teens end up having sex and eventually end up getting killed with special effects that were done by Tom Suzini. And mostly, Jason doesn't appear as the killer until the second movie, and actually the third movie is when he get the iconic hockey mask as well. Okay, most of the time they actually end up including the slasher movies. That was pretty much in the early part and most of the decade, including the horror comedies, like pretty much movies like 1985, like Reanimator, are some, and probably maybe Gremlins and Ghostbusters was kind of that, and of course even cheesy ones like Killer Clowns from Outer Space in 1988. In 1984, the guy Wes Craven had released the A Nightmare on Elm Street. He kind of got the idea from a newspaper article about the idea with the sleek acmea, with the thing of the Cambodian refugees and all, and introduced the horror icon Freddy Krueger, who actually is a sharp claw wearing killing guy who has actually been badly burned and takes revenge by killing kids in their dreams as well. And he also had its way of sequels as a series, just same as like with the Friday the 13th with Jason. Also, they also had. Oops. I also had. Oops, sorry about that with the spelling. Also had. And also in the 90s, with the early part was Candyman. That was also created to develop a horror icon that was similar like Freddy Krueger, with a more of an urban legend based setting with it about a university student that investigated about the Candyman in a public housing that was run down, full of gangs and poverty in Chicago. And if you say his name 5 times in the mirror, he'll probably appear with the last image with Tony Hawk, who actually had this most iconic voice to do that character. But mostly in the whole decade of the a little bit partly in the early part of the decade, they still had horror movies that were pretty much like the sequels, and they weren't actually as popular, as bigger as it is during that time until the mid part with. Until when the movie Scream, that was actually pretty much does the parody off of the horror movies and make cliches with them, and with the killer who actually wears a ghost mask and actually calls his victims in and does horror movie trivia, and if you get it wrong, you actually become the killers. And they also started that series, and it was actually directed by Wes Craven, the same guy who did A Nightmare on Elm Street after all. Well, they also did had its way of the horror movies, like the other ones, like I Know What You Did Last Summer and Urban Legend, and well, pretty much with. Also in 1999, they also had the Blair Witch Project, where had a group of filmmakers are actually searching for the Blair Witch in the woods, and well, woods, and kind of actually made the whole movie look like if they were really filming it there, and it was actually fake, and it was not exactly did exactly happen. Mm. And mostly the year two in the 2000s, you had stuff that was like sort of pretty much more the minor PG-13 thrillers, and a little bit to the remakes, and even taking stuff from Japanese cinema such as The Ring and The Grudge, and of course. And also in 2004, they also came out with Saw, that started the whole series of films until 2010, with the idea of the guy who actually is the killer, who doesn't physically kill them. They just kind of have his victims end up having themselves to cut themselves open to be free, or end up killing them after after all. It was kind of maybe the kind of started the whole torture movies. Okay. And also in 2005, the filmmaker Eli Roth come up with Hostel, about the group of college students who are actually backpacking in Europe, and and where they end up getting tortured by a rich guys who paid a lot of money to be tortured. After all, it was kind of considered was some of the goriest one ever, and it also happened to start the thing called torture porn. And they even had pretty much with that, with the torture. And they also did have horror movies with torture before this, and this was the one that term of that. Well, most of the time during the decade, it was pretty much mostly probably remakes and all that explain about that after all. And anyway, in 2010s, they also pretty much kind of the same way with the remakes and redoing kind of stuff like movies like The Conjuring or Annabelle has well, and still kind of actually have the horror movies by today. And anyway, and even though they're kind of going to be around quite a while, since they're kind of always popular a bit, especially this time of year of Halloween coming anyway, and even though they have different sub genres with it over the years, well, this is kind of sort of some of the information I'll get you about the horror movies. But I'll probably do other type of cinema history to explain a little bit more about other type of things with the different type of genres and subgenres, or some type of movie history as well. Well, I hope you actually watch it and keep subscribe to you a bit. And if you're and if it doesn't matter if you're late or not, I'm not giving you detention if you watch this late. And hope you keep up with the subscribers after all. And I'll let you know when the next class will be. And signing off, and class is dismissed.